The early morning light draped across the valley like a blanket, illuminating the small cottages scattered throughout the village. Nestled at the edge of town, just beyond the meadows and sheep pastures, was the home of Lila and her adoptive father, Ethan. Their modest cottage, bordered by a low stone wall, stood as one of the simplest structures in a place already defined by simplicity. Yet to Lila, the view from their front step was unmatched. Lila rose before dawn each day, her fingers numb as she gathered water from the well, and her breath visible in the crisp morning air. Her daily chores were the rhythm of her life, feeding the animals, mending fences, hauling firewood. She worked alongside Ethan, whose quiet, weathered smile was her morning greeting, his gruff words softened by affection. She adored him, and he, in turn, looked at her as if she were his whole world. But there was a subtle undercurrent in her heart, a strange stirring of curiosity. From time to time, when the wind blew in a certain direction, or when the village gathered to recount old stories, Lila wondered where she truly came from. Ethan had told her she was left with him as a baby, but whenever she asked about her past, he would only shake his head, his eyes clouded. Today, however, there was no time to think of such things. Lila was needed for the lambing season, and the hours flew by as she moved tirelessly between the pens, cleaning and caring for the newborns. She had no way of knowing how drastically her life would change soon, but a strange restlessness seemed to hover in the air, an omen she couldn't place. By evening, she sat with Ethan at their small table, his face half hidden in shadow from the single candle they could afford. They ate their humble meal in companionable silence, exchanging a few words about the day's work and the upcoming market. "Good crop this season," Ethan remarked, his rough voice breaking the quiet. Lila nodded, eyes tracing the flame. "Do you think it'll be enough to trade for new tools?" Ethan's lips twisted in a thoughtful expression. Maybe even a new coat for you," he said with a rare grin, his pride in her clear. She smiled back, warmth flooding her heart. This was her family, her life, and she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. And yet, somewhere deep within her, a question lingered. The next morning dawned damp and gray, with a chill that crept into Lila's bones as she went about her chores. She was in the barn, clearing hay and preparing feed for the animals, when her shovel scraped against something hard beneath the scattered straw. Curious, she knelt down, brushing aside the loose hay until she unearthed a small, weathered box, its wooden surface rough and scratched. The faint engraving of a crest caught her eye, two birds facing each other with an intricate knot between them. Her heartbeat quickened, and she looked around, as if the barn's shadows held secrets. Turning the box over in her hands, Lila hesitated. She knew Ethan wouldn't approve of her meddling with strange things from the past, but the box was calling to her. Unable to resist, she pried it open, the lid creaking as it revealed its contents, a delicate locket and a folded piece of parchment. The locket gleamed softly in the barn's half-light, and as she picked it up, she noticed an initial etched into its surface, L, the same letter as her own name. A chill ran down her spine. Who had this belonged to? And why was it hidden here? Hands trembling, Lila unfolded the parchment. Its words were faded, but she could make out a brief message. "For El, my dear one, we will be together soon. Trust in those who watch over you." The meaning of the message was a mystery, but the tone stirred something familiar within her, a sense of comfort and anticipation she couldn't explain. Her fingers brushed the locket again, and she slipped it over her neck instinctively, feeling its weight settle just below her collarbone. As she hid the box back under the hay, her mind spun. Who had left it? Did Ethan know about it? The questions swirled like a storm, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was only the beginning. That night, at the dinner table, she considered bringing it up with Ethan, her eyes drawn to his weathered face, which seemed to hold more secrets than he'd ever spoken aloud. She could sense the walls around him, built from years of silence and unasked questions. Did you ever find anything strange around here?" she ventured, her voice casual, though her pulse raced. Ethan looked at her, one brow raised. "Strange. Nothing but what comes in from the wind. Lila forced a small smile, her hand brushing the locket hidden beneath her dress. She realized, with a pang of fear and excitement, that this was a journey she might have to undertake on her own. The week passed quietly, but Lila's mind was anything but calm. She kept the locket hidden beneath her dress, feeling its weight as if it were urging her forward. She'd catch herself tracing the letter L with her fingers, wondering who it belonged to and what connection it might have to her past. Her routine was disrupted a few days later when a stranger arrived in the village. He was unlike anyone she had seen before, tall and sharply dressed, with an air of sophistication that seemed entirely out of place. The townsfolk whispered about him as he walked through the village square, each gaze trailing him with curiosity and suspicion. Lila was at the market stall, sorting produce with Ethan, when the stranger approached. His gaze found hers immediately, as if he'd known exactly where to find her. She shifted uncomfortably under his stare, feeling an inexplicable connection, as though he already knew her secrets. "Are you Lila?" he asked, his voice smooth and carefully measured. She glanced at Ethan, who was watching the man with narrowed eyes. "Yes," she replied, barely above a whisper. "My name is Gerard," he introduced himself, offering a slight bow. "I have information about your family." Lila's heart raced. Her first impulse was to deny it, to insist she didn't know what he was talking about, but the words failed her. She looked to Ethan for guidance, but his face was unreadable, a tightness around his mouth that she hadn't seen before. "I don't know what you're talking about," she managed, though her voice wavered. Gerard's eyes softened. "I understand this is sudden. I only wish to speak with you, privately, if you'd allow it." Before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward. "She's not interested," he said firmly, his gaze steely. Lila glanced between them, confusion and curiosity warring within her. "Wait," she murmured, placing a hand on Ethan's arm. Maybe I should hear him out." Ethan's expression shifted to one of disappointment mixed with worry, but he nodded reluctantly. Gerard gestured for her to follow, and with one last look at her adoptive father, Lila walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. They reached the edge of the village, and Gerard stopped beneath an ancient oak tree. He seemed to study her for a moment, as if measuring her reaction before he spoke. "Lila, you may not know this, but you have a birthright, a lineage that is far greater than you could imagine." He glanced at the locket around her neck. "I see you found the locket." Lila's fingers instinctively went to the pendant. Who am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gerard offered a faint smile. "You are of noble blood, connected to a family of considerable wealth and power. However, your family's legacy comes with complications. They left you in the care of others for your protection. Now, they wish to reunite." Lila's mind raced, caught between disbelief and a deep, inexplicable yearning. Could this be true? She had always suspected there was more to her past, but to hear it confirmed was overwhelming. "Why now?" she demanded, her voice stronger. "Why not tell me sooner?" Gerard hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "There are interests within your family that would prefer to keep you out of the picture, but not everyone agrees. Some of us believe you have a right to know your heritage." A storm of emotions swirled within her, and she could barely breathe. "And who exactly are you in all of this?" "Think of me as a messenger, someone who believes in your right to choose your own path," he said, his tone gentle. As Lila stood there, grappling with the weight of his words, she realized that this encounter was only the beginning of a journey that could change everything she thought she knew. The encounter with Gerard haunted Lila's thoughts for days. She tried to resume her life, but every chore, every quiet moment, brought her mind back to his words. Her past, the life she thought she knew so well, suddenly felt like a thin veneer over something much larger and infinitely more complex. Ethan noticed her distraction, his own eyes filled with unspoken questions. But he didn't press her, perhaps sensing that she needed time to make sense of things on her own. Lila was grateful, yet part of her longed for him to ask, to give her the answers she craved. Unable to let it go, Lila began to search the cottage, hoping to find something, anything, that might confirm or deny Gerard's claims. Late one night, while Ethan slept, she rifled through the few belongings they had, focusing on a small wooden chest Ethan always kept near his bedside. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid, guilt mingling with anticipation. Inside, she found a faded scrap of cloth with the same crest that adorned her locket. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart pounded as she traced the worn edges of the emblem. Lila. She froze, the sound of Ethan's voice making her heart race even faster. She turned slowly, guilt twisting her features. "Why, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with disappointment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the weight of her betrayal heavy in her chest. "I just needed to know if it was true. Gerard, he told me things about my family." Ethan's expression darkened. "You're my family," he said quietly, but there was pain in his voice. "That's all that should matter." "But if it's true," she insisted, tears stinging her eyes, "if I'm from some other family, don't I have a right to know?" Ethan's shoulders slumped, and he looked away. After a moment, he spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "Yes, I suppose you do." The sadness in his gaze was almost unbearable, but Lila knew she couldn't stop now. She had to know who she was, even if it meant hurting the man who'd been her entire world. That night, Lila didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the scrap of cloth, her mind spinning with questions. The next day, when she returned to the village, she felt the stares and whispers from the villagers who had noticed the stranger and pieced together her growing restlessness. But she no longer cared what they thought. Lila made a decision that day. She would seek Gerard's help. She needed answers, even if it meant facing a past she could barely imagine. The days following Lila's discovery were marked by a subtle, uncomfortable shift in the village. Gossip moved swiftly through the quiet community, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Some spoke of her supposed noble blood with envy, while others cast judgmental looks, their faces shadowed with suspicion. Lila noticed the change immediately. People who had once greeted her warmly now seemed to avoid her, their eyes flitting away as she passed. Children whispered behind cupped hands, and vendors at the market were suddenly less friendly, their smiles replaced by wary glances. Ethan, too, seemed affected by the shift in the villagers' attitudes. Though he didn't speak of it directly, his posture grew tense, and he spent more time tending to the animals than engaging in conversation. His usual steady demeanor faltered, and Lila could sense his silent struggle to accept her determination to uncover the truth. Lila tried to ignore the isolation pressing in on her, but as each day passed, she felt the weight of the village's disapproval settling heavily on her shoulders. Seeking solace, she returned to the oak tree where she had first spoken with Gerard, hoping he might reappear and answer the questions that had only grown louder in her mind. As if he sensed her need, Gerard soon arrived, emerging from the trees with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside her. He looked at her, his expression softening when he saw the confusion in her eyes. "The villagers," she began, her voice thick with frustration. "They're treating me as if I've done something wrong, simply because I want to know where I came from." Gerard nodded, understanding etched across his face. "Sometimes, the search for truth can feel like betrayal to those who believe they already know you," he replied. "But you have a right to understand your past, no matter how it might make others feel." His words bolstered her resolve, and she looked at him, determination replacing the uncertainty in her gaze. "Then tell me what you know," she said, her voice steady. "If I truly have family out there, I want to understand what it means." Gerard hesitated, glancing toward the village before finally nodding. "There is a family estate a few towns over. It's not the life you know here, Lila. There, your family's wealth and status come with expectations and alliances, and with complications." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "Your family's reputation is marked by secrets and divisions. Not all of them will welcome you." The words settled heavily upon her, but she felt more intrigued than fearful. For years, she had dreamed of uncovering her past, And now, despite the obstacles, she was closer than ever to finding answers. With Gerard's encouragement, Lila made up her mind. She would travel to the estate, confront the family she never knew, and finally uncover the mystery of her birth. Her decision filled her with purpose, and though the journey ahead seemed daunting, she felt a strange excitement coursing through her veins. As she returned to the cottage, Lila caught Ethan watching her from the doorway. She hesitated, meeting his gaze, but his expression was guarded. She realized that her decision had created a gulf between them that might not easily be bridged. That night, as she lay in bed, Lila felt both the thrill of anticipation and the ache of leaving the only home she had ever known. But she was resolute. Tomorrow, she would begin her journey. The morning of her departure dawned cold and gray, mirroring the heaviness in Lila's heart. She had packed her meager belongings the night before, wrapping her few treasures, a woolen scarf, a small carving Ethan had made for her as a child, and the locket, carefully in cloth. Ethan was already awake, standing by the fire with a quiet intensity in his gaze. She approached him, her footsteps hesitant, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "I'll be back," she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. But even as she spoke, she wasn't certain it was true. Ethan turned to her, his face lined with both worry and a lingering sadness. "I know you have to go, Lila," he said, his voice rough but kind. "But just remember, family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who stand by you when no one else will." Lila's chest tightened at his words, her heart torn between the man who had raised her and the answers that lay just beyond the horizon. She reached out, taking his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm against her own. "I'll always be grateful to you, Ethan. You've given me everything," she murmured. She hoped he could see the gratitude and love in her eyes, even if her decision hurt him. Ethan gave her a slight nod, his expression pained but understanding. "Just come back safe, that's all I ask." With a heavy heart, Lila gathered her things and stepped outside, feeling the chill of the morning air wrap around her like a second skin. Gerard was waiting for her at the edge of the village, his expression unreadable as she approached. With one last look back at the cottage, Lila took a deep breath and joined him, letting the weight of her decision settle fully. Their journey took them over hills and through dense forests, the scenery changing as they moved farther from the familiar. Gerard kept to himself, offering few words as they traveled, but his presence was a comfort amid the uncertainties swirling in Lila's mind. As they approached the estate, Gerard stopped, gesturing for Lila to walk with him to a quiet clearing off the main road. He looked at her, his eyes serious. "There's one thing you should know before you enter the estate," he said, his tone grave. "Not everyone there will accept you as family. There are those who see you as a threat, an intruder." Lila's stomach churned, but she lifted her chin, determination glinting in her eyes. "If they don't want me, then they should have left me with Ethan. But I deserve to know who I am, whether they accept me or not." Gerard's gaze softened, admiration flickering across his face. "Very well, but stay cautious, Lila. This world is different from the one you've known. Wealth can make people ruthless." They continued walking, and soon the estate came into view. The grand stone manor loomed against the horizon, its tall windows like dark eyes watching her approach. The building was imposing, cold and elegant, surrounded by meticulously groomed gardens that seemed as unwelcoming as the family she was about to confront. At the entrance, a stern-faced woman met them, her gaze sweeping over Lila with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "You must be the newcomer," she said, her tone clipped. Lila felt a pang of discomfort, but forced herself to meet the woman's gaze. "Yes, I'm here to meet my family." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Follow me, and I suggest you remember your place. Not everyone will be as tolerant." Lila's hands clenched at her sides, but she nodded, following the woman into the manor. The interior was just as cold as the exterior, the walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to judge her. As she was led to a grand sitting room, Lila felt the weight of the place settling upon her. She was here, finally, but the air was thick with hostility and expectations. Whatever awaited her, she would face it head-on. Lila walked cautiously through the grand corridors of the estate, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The walls were adorned with paintings, their somber faces seeming to follow her every move. The immensity of the manor was overwhelming, and with each step, she felt both smaller and more determined. The woman who had met her at the entrance, Mrs. Morland, the housekeeper, guided her to a spacious parlor and left her there with little more than a nod. "Your family will join you shortly," she had said, her words stiff and cold. Alone in the parlor, Lila took a steadying breath, her eyes sweeping the room. It was richly furnished, with velvet curtains and an elaborate fireplace, a stark contrast to the simple life she had known. She traced her fingers along a porcelain vase, wondering if this was the life she was truly meant to inherit, or if she was merely an outsider. The door creaked open, and Lila turned to see a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and a calculated expression. She was dressed impeccably, each detail exuding wealth and status. Lila's stomach twisted, but she met the woman's gaze steadily. "So, you're the one they've been speaking of," the woman said, her voice as precise and cutting as her appearance. "I am Lady Beatrice, your aunt, I suppose." She spoke the word as if it left a bitter taste. "Yes," Lila replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "I've come to understand my family and my past." Lady Beatrice's gaze narrowed. "I'm sure you have," she said, her tone edged with something bordering on disdain. "But let me be perfectly clear. This is not a homecoming. You are here only because others have decided it's your right. Not all of us agree." Lila felt a pang of anger flare within her, but she kept her expression calm. "I understand," she said. "I'm not here to take anything. I only wish to know the truth about my origins." Lady Beatrice's lips thinned, as if she were suppressing a retort. "Truth," she echoed, her eyes calculating. "Truth is a luxury few can afford. In this family, truth comes second to appearances and alliances." Before Lila could respond, a young man entered the room, his relaxed demeanor clashing with the tension between her and Lady Beatrice. He looked at Lila with mild curiosity, a faint smile playing at his lips. "So, this is our mysterious newcomer," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Forgive my mother. She's not one for pleasantries." He extended a hand. "I'm Edward, your cousin." Lila took his hand hesitantly, his friendly demeanor disarming her. Edward's presence seemed to diffuse some of the tension in the room, and she found herself relaxing slightly. As Lady Beatrice looked on, displeasure evident in her gaze, Edward guided Lila to a chair, gesturing for her to sit. "Mother has a flair for the dramatic, but you'll find the estate interesting," he said with a smirk. "There are secrets in these walls that most wouldn't dare uncover." Lila glanced between Edward and Lady Beatrice, sensing the web of power and control beneath their cordial words. She was beginning to see the complexities Gerard had warned her about, the silent battles waged behind polite facades. Determined not to let them intimidate her, Lila sat with her back straight, her heart steadying with each passing moment. She had come here to find the truth, and she would face whatever resistance lay ahead. Lila's days at the estate settled into a strange rhythm. She wandered the hallways, piecing together fragments of her family's history through faded portraits and whispered conversations. But as she delved deeper, she sensed a palpable tension lurking beneath the surface. Lady Beatrice was relentless in her coldness, making it clear that Lila's presence was tolerated, not welcomed. Edward, on the other hand, proved to be an unexpected ally, often joining her on walks around the grounds and sharing family stories that hinted at the tangled roots of their lineage. It was during one of these walks that Edward stopped, his gaze flickering over the distant tree-line as he lowered his voice. "You're not safe here, you know." Lila glanced at him, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much he should reveal. "There are people in this family who see you as a threat. Your existence complicates things, especially with the inheritance. Inheritance. The word hung heavy in the air, and Lila felt a new layer of understanding settle over her. I thought I was only here to learn about my origins. Edward let out a low sigh. Perhaps that's all you wanted, but that's not how they see it. In the eyes of some, your presence challenges their claim to the estate's wealth and status. Lila's heart pounded as she considered the implications. She had come here hoping to understand her heritage, but it seemed that her very existence posed a threat to those who valued power above all else. As she processed Edward's words, she felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Gerard standing there, his face grave. "Edward is right," he said. "You have a claim to more than just a name here, Lila, and not everyone is willing to share." A chill ran through her, and she tightened her grip on the locket beneath her dress. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gerard's gaze softened, and he took a step closer, his voice low. "Stay alert, and trust no one who seems too eager to help." His eyes flickered to Edward, whose expression remained unreadable. Over the next few days, Lila found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, each shadow in the grand hallways seeming to hold hidden eyes. She could sense the subtle animosity from Lady Beatrice, her dismissive glances and cutting remarks growing sharper by the day. One evening, Lila overheard a hushed conversation outside her room. Lady Beatrice's voice was unmistakable, cold and controlled. "If she refuses to leave, we will have to persuade her. She's a liability none of us need." Fear shot through Lila, and she stepped back, her mind racing. It was clear now. She was not only unwelcome, but actively being forced out. The estate, with all its grandeur and promise, had become a cage lined with threats. She slipped out of her room later that night and sought out Gerard, her heart pounding as she confided in him. "They're planning to get rid of me," she whispered, barely able to contain her panic. "I heard Lady Beatrice herself." Gerard's expression hardened, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we must be cautious. There are allies here, but we'll need to navigate carefully." Despite his comforting words, Lila's trust was fraying. Every face, every friendly gesture now seemed laced with ulterior motives. But as she prepared for whatever lay ahead, she steeled herself with the knowledge that her fight wasn't just for answers. It was for her place in this family, no matter how unwelcome. The tension within the estate was almost tangible. Lila felt it pressing on her, a weight that grew heavier with each whispered conversation she overheard or subtle glance cast her way. Lady Beatrice's disdain was no longer hidden, her words biting and her gestures dismissive. And yet, amid the hostility, Edward remained a steady presence. One rainy afternoon, Edward found Lila in the estate's library, poring over family records in an attempt to understand the tangled web of her lineage. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a faint smile. "Still digging, I see," he remarked, his tone laced with amusement. Lila looked up, offering him a small smile. "I have to know what's true," she replied. "If I'm here because of my bloodline, then I want to understand it." Edward nodded thoughtfully, crossing the room to sit across from her. "I admire your determination," he said. "Most people would have given up by now." His words surprised her, and she studied him closely. "Why do you support me, Edward?" "You have no reason to." He shrugged, his smile fading. "Perhaps I do. My mother has never been an easy person, but I believe that family, in some way, should matter." He leaned forward, his gaze serious. "Just because I grew up here doesn't mean I agree with everything that happens within these walls." A sense of relief washed over Lila. It was the first time since her arrival that she felt someone was truly on her side. She sensed that Edward's motives were genuine, though she remained cautious, aware of the complexities of their family. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Gerard, who appeared at the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Lila," he said, his voice low, "there's something you should know. I wasn't entirely honest when we first met." Edward raised an eyebrow, looking between them with newfound interest. "Oh, Lila felt her heart sink as she met Gerard's gaze, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" Gerard hesitated, then stepped closer. "I was sent here by your family to dissuade you from investigating further. But I didn't expect you to be so resilient. I changed my mind. I'm here now because I believe you deserve the truth, regardless of what others want." Lila's mind raced, a mixture of anger and betrayal clouding her thoughts. "So you lied to me?" "Not entirely," Gerard replied, his tone calm. "I never intended to harm you, only to delay your investigation. But now, I'm here to help you, if you'll still have me." Edward watched the exchange, a shadow of suspicion crossing his face. "So, you've been playing both sides?" Gerard's face tightened, and he nodded. "Yes, but I'm here for her now, no one else." Lila looked between the two men, uncertainty gnawing at her. Her journey had been marked by betrayal and mistrust, but she sensed sincerity in Gerard's words. "Fine," she said quietly. "I'll accept your help, but if you cross me again, I'll have no reason to trust anyone." Gerard nodded, relief softening his features. "You won't regret it." As they settled into a tentative alliance, Lila felt the unease in her heart lessen, if only slightly. She knew the battles ahead would require more than strength. They would demand loyalty, strategy, and trust, if such a thing still existed within the walls of the estate. With Edward and Gerard's alliance, Lila began to dig deeper into her family's history, determined to uncover the truth about her birthright. Her days were spent in a library, sifting through records, letters, and estate ledgers, each new piece of information sharpening her understanding of the family's legacy and the reasons for its divisions. But the closer she came to understanding her place, the more resistance she faced. Lady Beatrice was relentless, her cold gaze following Lila through the corridors, her words dripping with disdain at every opportunity. The housekeeper, Mrs. Morland, also grew colder, her brief glances filled with warnings. The entire household seemed united in pushing her out, making her feel like an outsider in her own family. One evening, after hours spent combing through documents, Lila stumbled upon a ledger with her mother's name listed among the family's accounts. Her pulse quickened as she read through the entries, each line detailing a complex financial arrangement that tied her mother's wealth to the estate. She realized that her mother had left a considerable fortune, one that seemed to have vanished over the years. Edward entered the library, drawn by her sudden excitement. She showed him the ledger, her finger tracing the lines of financial transactions. "They're hiding this," she whispered, her voice taut with anger. "My mother's fortune. It was meant for me." Edward's face darkened as he studied the records. "They've been lying to you," he said, his tone fierce. "This is why they didn't want you here." Lila felt a surge of anger, her hands clenching into fists. "I'm going to confront them. They have no right to keep this from me." But before she could take action, a shadow appeared at the door. Lady Beatrice stood there, her face a mask of disapproval. "Going through private records, are we?" she said, her voice ice cold. "You've overstayed your welcome, Lila. It's time you left." Lila took a steadying breath, meeting her aunt's gaze with defiance. "This is my family, too," she replied. "I have every right to know the truth about my inheritance." Lady Beatrice's expression hardened. "If you value your safety, you'll leave quietly," she warned. "There are forces here far greater than you understand." Edward stepped forward, his stance protective. "She has as much right to be here as anyone. Threatening her won't change that." Lady Beatrice's lips twisted into a scornful smile. "You'll regret this, both of you," she said, before turning sharply and disappearing down the corridor. The encounter left Lila shaken, her heart pounding with both fear and defiance. She had come to the estate for answers, and now that she was so close, she refused to back down. With Edward and Gerard by her side, she knew they could uncover the truth together, even if it meant standing against the family. That night, as she lay awake, the weight of her decision settled heavily upon her. She was risking everything, defying the power structure within the family, but she couldn't let them push her out. For the first time in her life, she felt truly entitled to the legacy left by her mother. With newfound resolve, she decided that tomorrow would bring a confrontation. If the family wanted her to leave, they would have to force her out. She would stand her ground, no matter the cost. The morning dawned gray and somber, casting a heavy gloom over the estate. Lila steeled herself, rehearsing her arguments as she prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Lady Beatrice and the family members who saw her as nothing more than a threat. With Edward and Gerard at her side, she felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. But as she made her way toward the grand dining room where the family gathered each morning, Gerard stopped her, his face etched with worry. "There's something you need to know," he began, his tone low. "I heard whispers, plans to undermine your claim, to make sure you have no power here." Lila's heart sank. She had anticipated resistance, but hearing Gerard's warning made it feel more real, more imminent. What are they planning? Gerard hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the corridor behind them. "They're going to challenge your legitimacy. If they succeed, it could sever your claim entirely." Lila's pulse quickened, her mind racing. She had known there would be opposition, but the idea of losing her birthright stung more deeply than she had anticipated. She glanced over at Edward, his face clouded with anger as he listened to Gerard's words. "If they want to fight, then they'll have one," Edward declared, his voice fierce. "Lila, you don't have to face this alone. I'll stand by you no matter the cost." His loyalty filled her with courage, but just as she opened her mouth to respond, a figure emerged from the shadows, Mrs. Morland, the housekeeper. Her expression was dark, her gaze cold as she approached them. "Miss Lila," she said, her voice as sharp as her stare, "I must advise you not to pursue this further. For your own sake, leave before it's too late." Lila squared her shoulders, defiance hardening her resolve. "I have a right to be here. This is my family." The housekeeper's face twisted with something like pity. "Family," she scoffed. "Blood ties do not make you one of us. You were abandoned for a reason, cast away because you were a liability. Do you really believe anyone here cares about your claim?" The words struck her like a physical blow, and Lila felt the ache of betrayal settle in her chest. She had always believed that her heritage would unite her with this family, but hearing Mrs. Morland's harsh words made her realize the extent of their disdain. She was not welcome here, not truly. Without another word, Mrs. Morland turned and strode away, leaving Lila standing in stunned silence. Edward placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his expression filled with sympathy. "They don't know you," he murmured. "They see you as a threat, not as family. But I see your strength, Lila. You belong here just as much as any of them." Lila swallowed, forcing back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She felt as though her heart had shattered, but she clung to Edward's words like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, grateful for his presence. But as they headed to the dining room, a sense of dread settled over her. This confrontation would be unlike any she had faced before, a true test of her resilience and determination. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough. Lila entered the grand dining room with her head held high, flanked by Edward and Gerard. The family members were gathered, their eyes cold and watchful as she approached. At the head of the table sat Lady Beatrice, her expression one of icy control. Lila felt every gaze on her, the weight of judgment pressing down on her, but she refused to waver. Lady Beatrice folded her hands, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "You've caused enough disruption here," she began, her voice cold. "It's time for you to leave, Lila. Whatever notions you have about inheritance or family are illusions. You are not one of us." Lila's heart pounded, but she steadied her voice. "I came here to understand my family, to learn about my mother, and the legacy she left behind. Your mother," Lady Beatrice sneered, "was a fool. She thought she could change this family, reshape it according to her whims. She was wrong, and so are you." The anger that had simmered within Lila boiled over. Maybe she was trying to change something that was already rotten. If this is what family is, disdain, betrayal, manipulation, then I'd rather be alone than among people like you. Lady Beatrice's lips curled into a mocking smile. "You should have stayed with your shepherd father. At least he understood his place." Edward's hand clenched into a fist, and he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Enough, Mother. You can't dismiss her like this. Lila is family, whether you accept it or not." Lady Beatrice's gaze hardened, a cold fury sparking in her eyes. "You would defend this outsider over your own mother?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady, "because she deserves to know the truth. You may control this estate, but you don't control the truth." A murmur ran through the room, the other family members exchanging uncertain glances. Gerard stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about bloodlines or inheritance. Lila came here seeking answers, and she has a right to them." Lady Beatrice's face flushed with anger, but Lila sensed a flicker of fear beneath her carefully controlled exterior. Her aunt's authority was crumbling, and the family's loyalty was beginning to waver. "You think you're entitled to this estate?" Lady Beatrice spat, her voice laced with venom. "You know nothing about the sacrifices made to keep this family's reputation intact. You are a naive girl, clinging to some imagined birthright." Lila felt the sting of her words, but held her ground. "I may be young, but I know what loyalty and family truly mean. You may have all the wealth and power, but you're empty inside. That's why you can't understand me." Lady Beatrice's face twisted in fury, and she rose from her chair, her composure finally slipping. "Get out," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Leave this estate and never return. If you value your life, you'll heed this warning." But before Lila could respond, another voice broke the tension. An older man, one of Lady Beatrice's cousins, spoke up, his voice weary. "Perhaps we've been too harsh," he said, glancing around the room. "The girl has a right to know her roots. If she's here for the truth, we should let her have it." The family fell silent, and Lady Beatrice's expression turned dark as the support she once held began to wane. Lila seized the moment, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I only wanted to understand where I came from. If my mother's legacy is something you're ashamed of, then maybe it's time for this family to change." Lady Beatrice looked as if she'd been struck, her fury simmering just below the surface. But she said nothing, her authority slipping as the other family members cast her hesitant glances. The confrontation had exposed her cruelty and pettiness, and it was clear that her hold over the family had been shaken. Lila took a deep breath, feeling both victorious and drained. She had faced her aunt's wrath and emerged with her dignity intact. For the first time since arriving, she felt a sense of belonging, not because of her birthright, but because she had chosen to stand up for herself. With Edward and Gerard beside her, she turned and left the room, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and pride. She knew her journey wasn't over, but this battle had been won. She had faced her family's darkest sides and emerged unbroken. As they walked back through the grand corridors, Edward looked at her, a smile breaking across his face. "You were brilliant," he said softly. "You didn't just claim your place, you earned it." Lila felt a warmth spread through her, gratitude and resolve intertwining. She had come to understand her family, and in the process, she had found herself. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she could face it, because she belonged, in her own way, to a legacy she could now shape. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the estate grounds, filtering through the towering trees and bathing the garden paths in light. Lila walked alongside Edward, their steps quiet as they strolled through the estate grounds. The air felt lighter, free from the tension of the previous night's confrontation. Though her place within the family was not fully accepted, she felt a newfound strength within herself. The family's hostility had waned slightly, the memory of Lady Beatrice's fury a lingering reminder of the fractured unity that held them all together. Despite this, Lila sensed a shift among the other relatives, a tentative willingness to accept her presence, though perhaps not with open arms. Some even offered nods of acknowledgement as she passed, their gestures small but meaningful. As they walked, Edward glanced over at her, his expression thoughtful. "I know this wasn't the welcome you imagined, but I hope you found something worth staying for," he said. Lila nodded, her gaze drifting over the estate's manicured lawns and ornate statues. "I came looking for my family, but what I found was complicated," she admitted. "But I know now that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who care about you." Edward smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You're right, and I'm glad you stayed, despite everything. I don't know what the future holds for this family, but I believe you'll help make it better." They continued walking in companionable silence, and Lila felt a deep gratitude for Edward's loyalty. He had been her strongest ally, and she was beginning to see him not just as a cousin, but as a true friend, perhaps the closest she had ever known. As they reached the main entrance, Lila's gaze fell on the shepherd's staff she had brought with her from home, leaning against the wall as a reminder of the life she had left behind. She picked it up, feeling the familiar weight in her hands, and thought of Ethan. She wondered how he was faring without her, and felt a pang of longing for the simplicity of the life they had shared. "I need to return to the village," she said, her voice quiet. "Ethan deserves to know the truth. He's been my family all along, and he deserves to know what I've found here." Edward nodded in understanding. "Of course. I'll make arrangements for you to visit." A few hours later, with Gerard's help, Lila was on her way back to the village. The journey felt different this time. She was no longer an orphan searching for a place to belong, but a young woman who had faced the shadows of her past and come through stronger. When she reached the cottage, the sight of Ethan waiting for her at the gate brought tears to her eyes. His face lit up with relief as he embraced her, his arms strong and comforting. "You came back," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't sure if you would." Lila pulled back, meeting his gaze. "I had to, Ethan. You're my family, and you always will be." She told him everything, the estate, the family secrets, and the harshness she had endured. Ethan listened in silence, his face unreadable, but she could see the pride in his eyes. When she finished, he took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I've always known you were meant for something bigger, Lila," he said, his voice gentle. "But no matter what you find out there, remember where you came from. This is your home too." Lila nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in her heart. The estate might hold the wealth and status her family had left behind, but this cottage held something far more precious, a sense of belonging, of love without conditions. After her visit with Ethan, Lila returned to the estate with a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer a girl searching for answers, but a young woman determined to honor both her adoptive and birth families by forging a legacy that would reflect her values. The hostility she had once faced from the family began to shift, softened by her steadfastness. With Edward's encouragement, Lila turned her attention to the estate's finances. She discovered that a portion of her mother's wealth, long hidden or overlooked by Lady Beatrice, was still accessible, albeit in modest amounts. She decided to use these funds to bring improvements to both the estate and the village, a gesture of goodwill and an acknowledgement of her own journey from poverty to newfound heritage. Lila worked tirelessly, meeting with the estate staff and villagers alike. She began organizing repairs to the estate's aging structures, commissioning craftsmen from the village to revitalize sections of the grounds that had fallen into disrepair. Her decision to employ locals won the respect of the villagers, and slowly, their suspicion gave way to acceptance. Word spread through the village that the young woman who had come from humble beginnings was now working to uplift their community. She became a bridge between the villagers and the estate, fostering a sense of unity that had been absent for generations. Her actions began to change the family's perception of her, and even those who had once seen her as an outsider began to view her as a force of positive change. Lady Beatrice, however, remained distant, her pride keeping her from acknowledging Lila's efforts openly. But Lila noticed a subtle shift in her aunt's demeanor, a flicker of respect that, while unspoken, marked a small victory. One day, as Lila was overseeing a renovation near the estate's garden, Edward approached her, his face bright with approval. "You've accomplished more in a few months than this family has done in years," he said with admiration. "I think Mother is finally realizing that you're not just a passing storm." Lila laughed, the sound carrying through the garden. "I'm not here to storm in and leave, Edward. This is my family's legacy, and if I can make it a place that feels like home, then I'll stay." His smile softened, and he reached for her hand. "Then let's make it something worth staying for. Together." Their hands clasped. Lila felt a sense of hope she hadn't known she needed. She had come to the estate seeking a place to belong, but in building something greater than herself, she had discovered a family, a purpose, and a home. As the days passed, Lila's vision took shape. The estate, once a symbol of power and isolation, transformed into a place that welcomed both family and villagers alike. Her efforts forged new relationships, brought people together, and began healing wounds that had festered for years. Through her work, Lila realized she had truly become a part of the legacy her mother had left behind, a legacy not built on wealth or status, but on compassion, resilience, and a deep connection to the land and people who had shaped her. And with each passing day, Lila's presence breathed new life into the estate, her journey of self-discovery weaving into the fabric of a family that, through her strength and perseverance, had found a new path forward. Months had passed since Lila's arrival at the estate, and the changes she had set in motion were evident everywhere she looked. The gardens were flourishing, the repairs to the manor were nearly complete, and the village's relationship with the family had shifted from wariness to genuine trust. The estate was no longer an isolated bastion of power, but a gathering place for both family and villagers alike. Lila stood in the garden one morning, taking in the sight of her handiwork. She marveled at how much had changed, not only in her surroundings, but within herself. She had come searching for answers about her past, and though she had faced hostility, betrayal, and heartbreak, she had also found strength, purpose, and a true sense of belonging. Edward joined her, his presence a steady comfort as they looked over the estate together. "It feels like an entirely new place," he said, a smile on his face. "And it's because of you." Lila smiled back, her heart warm with gratitude. "I may have sparked it, but it took all of us to make it what it is." As they spoke, Lady Beatrice appeared in the garden, her expression softer than Lila had ever seen. She approached them, her gaze fixed on Lila with an intensity that was both somber and respectful. "Lila," she began, her voice low, "I may not have welcomed you kindly, but I've come to see that you have brought more to this family than I ever imagined." She paused, swallowing, as if the words were difficult to say. "Thank you for all you've done." The simple acknowledgement felt like a victory, and Lila met her aunt's gaze, nodding respectfully. "I only wanted to honor my mother's memory and give this family something worth preserving." Lady Beatrice's lips softened in a faint smile, and with a final nod, she turned and walked away. Lila watched her go, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. The acceptance might have come late, but it was enough. Later that evening, as the sun set over the estate, Lila gathered with Edward and Gerard in the main hall, discussing plans for the coming season. She had already set aside funds for continued improvements to the village, and the estate was thriving under her guidance. The success was bittersweet. She had found what she came for, but now a new question loomed in her heart. "What's next?" Edward asked, voicing the thought that had been circling her mind. Lila looked at him, a mixture of excitement and hesitation in her eyes. "I think there's more out there for me. I've come to understand who I am and where I belong, but I feel there are still pieces of my mother's story left to uncover." Gerard nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Your mother traveled widely before she settled here. Perhaps her legacy goes beyond these walls." Edward's face softened, his gaze filled with understanding. "You'll always have a place here, Lila. Whether you choose to stay or explore, this will be your home." Lila felt a swell of gratitude and smiled, realizing that she was no longer bound by the need for validation or acceptance. She had found her place, but she was also free to chart her own course. Her journey had not just been about uncovering her past, but about discovering the strength within herself to choose her future. In the days that followed, Lila made preparations to set off on a new adventure. She planned to travel and uncover more of her mother's life, seeking answers beyond the estate. But she knew she would always return to this place, to the family and community she had helped rebuild. On her final morning at the estate, as she stood in the garden one last time, Ethan arrived from the village to see her off. His face was filled with pride as he embraced her, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made a difference here, Lila. I'm proud of you." "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "For everything." With a final wave to Edward, Gerard, and Lady Beatrice, Lila set off, her heart filled with hope and purpose. She was no longer a lost orphan or an outsider, but a young woman with a family, a home, and a legacy of her own. As she walked away, her gaze lingered on the estate one last time, knowing she was leaving it better than she found it. She had fulfilled her purpose here, but her story was far from over. With each step, she embraced the promise of new horizons, her past woven into the strength that would carry her forward. Lila's journey was just beginning. Hey, everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us bring you more stories like this. We'd love to hear from you, so let us know in the comments. What moment in the story impacted you the most? Was it the family secrets, Lila's journey to find herself, or maybe her final farewell to the estate? And while you're here, we'd love to hear your ideas for future stories. If there's a theme, character, or adventure you'd like to see, drop your suggestions below. Who knows? Your idea might just be our next featured story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.